solid, liquid, gas. Water is formless. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. And thank you again, Susan, and to the Women's Athletic Club for hosting this series on water. The motivation for this series is to emphasize the centrality of water to human history. And for the past few months, the daunting vastness of the subject has been viewed through the filters of humanity, environment, and economics. We will touch upon ethics today. October's presentation, Watercolors, alluded to the environmental aspects of water, where the colors indicated levels of pollution, sometimes the spectacular colors produced by nature via algae and bacteria, or sediments, watercolors shown here in Iceland, ranging from milky gray or brownish red, depending on the nature of the silt that they carry. November's perspective was economic, reining the waters that undergirded colonialism and now capitalism. Shown here are the assembled data depicting global shipping routes. Each year, more than 11 billion tons of products gets carried around the world by large ships. Everything from clothes, flat screen TVs, grains, cars, oil, and natural gas. Transporting these goods from port to port is literally what makes the global economy go round. Our final issue on the water series today is about glaciation, which is glacier melting. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. Oh, I made a mistake. I wrote this twice. Well, I do highly recommend it, so I'm stressing it. Sorry about that. Due to climate change, the polar ice caps are melting at an alarming rate, and most of us are aware about their impact on animals and sea life, be they polar bear or any other creature in that region. But that is not the focus of today's narrative. The fulcrum for this presentation is the verb move, meaning to change positions or make progress. Specifically, movement of the glaciers in context of geography, people, and the glacier's ability to move us spiritually. So let's start with geography. The first thought that comes to my mind for the geographical implication of glaciation, glacier melting, is sweet home Chicago. In fact, Bobby, you asked me where I was. I'm sitting right now somewhere right there. I see that view looking out the window. It'll soon be apparent why Chicago is what comes to mind when I think of glacial melting. So let's start with a solid understanding of what is a glacier and how do they form. So glaciers form over years as more snow piles up than it melts. After falling and accumulating, the snow becomes denser and more tightly packed, and newer snow falls and buries the snow from the previous year, represented here, I'm going to point now, in this yellow. And this bottom layer becomes more compressed. And then the dense grainy ice that survives 1 year's melt is called a firn. When this ice grows thick enough, the firn layers fuse into a huge mass called glacial ice. This process takes years. The Laurentine ice sheet was a large mass of ice that covered most of what is now Canada and the United States. It had formed 2.6 million years ago and started to decline about 11,000 years ago. So the polar ice cap melted across the continent about 5 times, advancing and retreating due to changes in the climate. As they move due to the compression melting, which is melting on the bottom, shifts the glaciers, they left behind landscape features, including valleys, mountains, and lakes. This vast landmass was covered in snow and ice, which advanced and retreated over centuries. As the glaciers moved, they carried within it rocks and boulders that they picked up along their journey. And once the glaciers started melting, a wide variety of landforms were created by dumping, pushing, and squeezing these loose rock material. Distinct ridges or mounds of debris that are laid down directly by a glacier or pushed up by a glacier are called moraines. There are different classifications of moraines, including terminal ones and the ones on the side, lateral moraine. After the last ice sheet melt of North America, these receding glaciers left behind moraines that are still visible. It is this glacial melt that formed the Great Lakes of the Midwest, Lakes Superior, Huron, Erie, and etc. In fact, our Lake Michigan is called so because the melting waters had filled the Michigan Basin. As depicted in the illustration on the left, I'm going to point now. So this area here, which is called the outwash, running water from the melting ice of a glacier is what is an outwash. This outwash carries deposits of sand and gravel, and the sand and gravel were formed when the glacier picked up rocks and boulders, and the water pressure from the glacier crushed these rocks to fine gravel and sometimes sand. The outwashes from the Midwest region accumulated in the area, now recognized as the Mississippi River Basin. And so the Illinois River section, I'm going to point now, around here, joined the Great Mississippi and emptied into the Gulf of Mexico further down south. So those glaciers have had a lasting impact. For instance, without this body of water formed by the melting glacier, the author Samuel Clemens wouldn't have been called Mark Twain. Glacier melts provide most of the fresh water on our planet. Here in the Midwest region, glaciers birthed the Great Lakes. Fresh water is vital for irrigating the Great Lake Basin's agricultural industry, which includes Canada and the United States. The Great Lakes are the largest body of fresh water in the world and provide drinking water for 35 million people. And these lakes, together with the canals and the rivers, form a waterway system that links the St. Lawrence River from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the lakes Huron, Ontario, Erie, and Superior are the boundary between United States and Canada. Only Lake Michigan is entirely in the United States. The physical landscape and surface geology of the Midwest are the legacy of the most recent of several continental glaciations, or these glacial melts. That's why glaciers shaped this beauty, Chicago, and comes first to mind when I hear glacial melting. The debris that the glaciers had carried were, as I had said before, crushed into fine sand, one example of which are the Indiana dunes. I use the photography from one of the attendees here. So Marty, if you're here, I use one of your photographs because I could see, if you look far away, there is the city of Chicago right there. So thank you for letting me use it, Marty. So the glaciers shaped Illinois, not just up in the Chicago region. The topography of northern Illinois is very different from the south because the glaciers went only about halfway of our state. Compared to the mainly flat lands of the Chicago region, melting glacier wear and tear over perhaps 450,000 years has formed this hilly erosion, this landscape in Adams County, which is east of Quincy in Western Illinois. Fast flowing glacial meltwater streams deposited coarse sand and gravel, the outwash that was mentioned earlier, in front of glacial margins. And these are still evident when you drive away from the city. Deposits such as this, as shown on the right, make excellent aquifers for groundwater supply when found below the water table. And glaciers never reached far south in Illinois, hence the high relief of those areas. Over millions of years, weathering and stream erosion carved the landscape of southern Illinois. Much of Illinois may have looked like this, sandstone cliffs and steep canyons prior to glaciation. Now that the continuing relevance of historic glaciation has been illustrated, or I hope it has been illustrated, let's move into our present and then into the future. So there are two types of glaciers: alpine glaciers, where the glaciers form on mountainsides and move downwards through the valleys, and sometimes, or quite often, create valleys by pushing dirt and soil and other materials out of the way. The second kind of glacier is the continental ice sheets. Continental glaciers are continuous masses of ice that are much larger than alpine glaciers. Greenland and most of Antarctica are continental ice sheets. The lifespan of the recognizable iceberg of those regions, so to go from snowfall on a glacier to finally melting into the ocean, can be up to 3,000 years. Small continental glaciers are called ice fields, and these exist in various parts of our globe. In Alaska, in Argentina, Norway. And calving is what happens when chunks of ice breaks off at the terminus, and there's a distinct cracking sound that heralds such an event. One of the causes of increasing ice cap melting and calving, which is the crushing of the icebergs at the terminus ending, is the increased heating of our planet for the past century. So calving and melting ice caps add fresh water to the sea levels. The sea levels thereby rise. Large additions of fresh water changes the ocean's ecosystem and ocean currents. Less salt in the ocean due to the addition of fresh water can affect the Gulf Stream, which can change weather patterns on land as well. Ice, specifically the areas of Arctic and Antarctic, is an area of intense interest, mainly, unfortunately, due to potential commodities that have been discovered in the waters. But more importantly, the Antarctica is thought to contain up to a quarter of the planet's marine methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. And as these regions continue to heat up, dormant methane deposits trapped beneath age-old ice could escape into the atmosphere, triggering a more ferocious melting cycle. But that is not the focus of this portion of the presentation. This section is about movement, the impact of glaciation on geography, how glaciers shaped land. These rivers of ice that over millennia have melted and molded landscapes and formed lush, verdant valley. Recognizing the profound retreat due to global warming truly saddened me, because this is how far out the glacier in the background, I don't know if you can see it right there in the back, this white river of ice. This is how far out it was about a little over 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Quite a disturbing visualization, isn't it? It's visualizing a very slow moving process because glaciers sometimes move about 25 centimeters a day. So every drop of the melting of the glacier, every drop counts and adds to this massive retreat. A melting hanging glacier is a spectacular sight just on its own. But the visuals are elevated when it is atop a mountain in a natural amphitheater surrounded by thickly forested hills and with a milky green lagoon to catch its cascading ice and meltwater. Isn't it remarkable? Some glaciers are remarkable simply due to their location. So for example, there are glaciers on the equator, which is the invisible line that runs around the center of the Earth at 0 degrees latitude. So in theory, locations on the equator experience 12 hours a day and 12 hours of night exactly. So the proximity of the equator can be clearly identified from the sky, because since the equator divides the Earth into the northern and southern hemispheres, one realizes the two separate arcs in the starry sky. What I was trying to do is capture a picture of, long exposure. You can see the stars going in a circular motion on the left-hand side, separating the two hemispheres. I don't know if it comes across, but that was the reason for adding this on. I love finding these quirky little details and sharing them with you. The equatorial glaciers are marked on this map. One is in Uganda, a country, as I mentioned earlier, this is one that I really want to visit, not least because of its near perfect year-round 78-degree weather that complements its magnificent vistas. But Uganda's Rwenzori Glacier is on Mount Stanley, which is on the Congo-Uganda border. But the glaciers there are in dire conditions and expected to disappear in a decade or two. 400 meters below the disappearing ice field, the communities of Ugandan coffee farmers see that the climate change has disrupted rainfall patterns, giving them more intense rains and then drier spells. The issue of climate change is very complex. So Uganda, as a country, had joined the Rights of Nature movement, which is a legal movement to give nature an aspect to be able to sue on behalf of nature. It's done to protect biodiversity. But at the same time, the country won't stop oil drilling because reducing poverty for Uganda is a higher priority than mitigating climate change. So poverty and climate change is sometimes incompatible when determining political negotiations. The French and Chinese drilling companies provide compensation for those in Uganda who are displaced. But really, how does one exactly compensate a displaced giraffe, I wonder? Another equatorial glacier, Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, a snow-covered mountain on the equator, an absolute ocean of green forest surrounded by dry savanna. The mountain is a gargantuan layer cake of lava and volcanic ash that surged out of the faults along the eastern edge of Africa's Great Rift Valley. Glaciers abraded. The ice cores show that the glaciers were about 11,700 years old. So they're from the same time as when the North American ice fields that eventually formed the Great Lakes in the United States. So the time frame is very similar. Kilimanjaro's glaciers will all be gone in the next 20 to 30 years due to global warming. Buddhist temples like Borobudur come to mind at the mention of Indonesia. And very few people recollect the Puncak Jaya glaciers because Indonesia has glaciers. This mountain was first climbed by Heinrich Harrer, he of the 7 Years in Tibet story and the subsequent movie that was made. And changes in the Puncak Jaya glacier cover is unfortunately very similar to that in other parts of the world. You have glacier melts happening almost everywhere, including the United States. In 1850, there were about 150 massive glaciers in what is now the Glacier National Park near the Canadian border in Montana. Today, from that 150, only 25 remain, and scientists believe even the largest of them will disappear by 2030. Moving on to Sweden. Sweden's only remaining mountaintop glacier, which until 2019, just a year or two ago, well, 2 years ago by now, was also its highest peak. And it has lost 2 meters, which is about 6 feet in the past year due to rising air temperatures driven by climate change. Moving on to Switzerland, still in Europe, the Swiss alpine towns and villages heavily depend on snow because up to 90% of their economy is dominated by winter tourism. Melting snow and glaciers in the Alps provide water for heavily populated and farmed areas far downstream, even during hot and dry summer months. Swiss hydropower companies use this water to generate a large share of the needed electricity. So glaciation is of tremendous concern here. People migrate, move to better areas, and companies consider moving as well. Not good for the economy. The Marmolada, the largest and most symbolic glacier in the Dolomites, now we're in Italy, could vanish within 15 years because of global heating. The glacier has already lost more than 80% of its volumes over the last 70 years. And movements one perhaps didn't expect. This bridge in South Iceland was built in the early 1970s over a large glacial river. In 2009, as a result of the retreat of an outlet glacier, the river changed course, leaving the bridge spanning mostly dry sand. In 2019, the Russian Navy discovered new islands revealed by melting glaciers in the remote Arctic. Russia has opened a string of military and scientific bases in the Arctic in recent years. And do realize not everyone bemoans rising temperatures, as they can open up shipping routes and make hitherto inaccessible mineral resources easier to exploit. The much coveted Northwest Passage up in the Arctic region would be a manna for shipping companies because it would reduce their shipping costs. So glacial movements in geography has affected our cultures, the humanity aspect of our lives. So the proverbial silk routes from about 2100 years ago depend a lot on glaciation. These trade networks linked countries and cultures. And what also traveled is that influence traveled. So for example, tulips that are commonly associated with Holland actually comes from the Tian Shan mountain regions near Central Asia. So along with the silk textiles and the proverbial silk roads that were imported from the East, the tulip flower motif that is evident in the middle picture right there, the tulips are there, and you can see some tulips in here too, red right there. These motifs show up in our Western design, and this is Armani 2020. On the right, this is Ikat print. These designs were also another Far Eastern export. And in terms of manuscript, this Quran is written on burnished gold Chinese paper. So keep in mind, Iran using paper from China to create their books of the Quran. The Western exposure to Eastern aesthetics is revealed in illustrations by the French Edmond Dulac, shown on the right. So the Japanese artist Hokusai, his influence is evident. And I chose this for you, Bobby. I figured you'd like it. And Dulac had acknowledged his influence, that he was influenced by Hokusai. It's very obvious. The 36 views of Mount Fuji, which is better known as, I think, popularly known as the Great Wave of Kanagawa. You can see the similarities, right, in his depiction in this illustration for the children's book. In fact, the stories that populate many of the Western imaginations. So for example, here, the French Jean de La Fontaine credits the Indian authors from about 300 BCE being before current era, for many of the stories that now enrich the French culture. And so we have shared historically for thousands of years and learned from each other. You may be wondering, how is this connected to glaciers? Well, as the caravans traveled through the mountains, journeys that took months, if not years, the evening resting spots for the travelers and the traders were caravanserais. And these depended on the water from the glacier melts. When the waters dried up, towns were literally deserted. There were tons of towns that are found deserted throughout the Taklamakan areas of that. Some of them were unearthed years later by scholars such as Sir Mark Aurelstein, and many of these discoveries are now in the British Library, actually in the storage. I would love to get my hands on them to see what's in there. So our narrative continues, because now the movement is in context of people and about the ice house conditions that enabled human global expansion. The growth of the northern ice sheets drew so much water out of the oceans that the dropping sea levels exposed great areas of the continental shelves. It is the ice age that allowed our ancestors to simply walk across dry lands to areas such as Indonesia, cross the narrow sea into Australia, and crucially make our way, or our ancestors' way, along the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. Alongside providing the conditions that enabled humanity to spread across the globe, past ice ages have had other far-reaching implications for the molding of the landscapes we inhabit and the course of our history. So it is not at all disputed. It's a very heavily accepted fact that our species originated in Africa and spread from that birthplace. The region marked in yellow right there, which is now covered by Iraq and Iran, acted as a major dispersal hub with human migration streams heading up into Europe and across the rest of Asia, into Australia, and then the Americas. It seems likely that the humans first headed east, following the southern margin of Eurasia to India and Southeast Asia. And this was an early offshoot from this path that took humans into Europe 45,000 years ago. So effectively, they started from here. Some went down, some went up. So this eastern migration split into two routes on either side of the Himalayas, with one path leading north across Siberia and eventually into the Americas through the Bering Straits, because the Bering Straits are up here. And the second taking a southerly route across Southeast Asia towards Australia. So our ancestors reached Southeast Asia and China around 50,000 years ago, 50,000 to about 45,000 years ago. Owing to the ice age conditions, the global ocean levels were over 100 meters. This is about 300 feet lower than they are today. The shallow seas around Indonesia were exposed as dry land. So the Indonesian archipelago became part of an extension of Southeast Asia known as Sundaland, with a chain of islands studding a very narrow sea, which helped our migration into this southeastern corner of the world. The slow wave of dispersal eventually reached the northeastern tip of Eurasia. And it is here that the ice age conditions provided most crucial for human migration. It allowed us a route to enter into the America. So today, the coasts of Russia and the United States are separated by an 80-kilometer wide Bering Strait. But during the last ice age, with the dropping of the sea levels then, the land of Siberia and Alaska, so it's right in these regions, would have extended to reach towards each other, like the outstretched fingers of Adam and God, painted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, until eventually they touched. And the two vast continents, all this area of Eurasia, and so this is the Eurasian continent, and here is America, were joined. And humans made it across this land bridge into America sometime after about 20,000 years ago. So after walking across the land bridge of the Bering Strait into Alaska, humanity worked its way down through the Americas as the ice sheets receded. They crossed the Panama Isthmus into South America around 12,500 years ago and reached the very southern tip of the South American continent within another millennia. And by then, humanity had encompassed the entire globe. The micro effects on people due to the macro geographical effects of glaciation, glacier melting, is significant. So glacial melt rivers were explored by Lewis and Clark, the adventurers. So these rivers, which are the product of glacial melt, provided transportation routes around the Appalachian Mountains. Without these rivers and access into the West, the original 13 colonies might have remained confined to the Atlantic seaboard. And across the pond, so to speak, 500,000 years ago, Britain was not an island. It was still part of the continental Europe, physically connected to France like conjoined twins by an isthmus, which is just like a land bridge, running between Dover and Calais. With the subsequent thawing after each ice age and the rise in sea levels, in between the interglacial periods, this passage filled with water, and hence we now have the English Channel. And this channel has served as a natural defense moat for Great Britain throughout European history. Because can you imagine Napoleon's Grand Army in 1805 or the Spanish Armada, what the history would have been if the waters didn't protect Britain? did you expect glaciers in Iran? I originally didn't. Their surprising occurrence in an arid landscape is a boon for people relying on glacial ice for fresh water source. About 60% of the country's water resources for urban industries and agriculture in Iran depend on their natural glaciers. But our focus for this section about people is the Tibetan Plateau Range, known now as the third pole, besides the North and the South Pole, because there are over 56,000 glaciers in this region. It is a vast region that includes the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and Pamir Mountains, which together form an arc across Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. So depending on the rate of global warming, 1/3 to 2/3 of the region's glacier will disappear by next century, so by 2100. This is a dire prediction for some 1.9 billion South Asians who rely on the glaciers for water, just like Iran relies on her glaciers. But the South Asians don't rely on it simply for drinking and sanitation, but also for agriculture, hydroelectric power, and tourism. Due to warming climates, the Himalaya, long defined by its glacier, is rapidly becoming a mountain range defined by glacial lakes. Between 1990 and 2010, more than 900 new glacier-fed lakes were formed across Asia's high mountain ranges. And due to meltwater, these lakes are prone to flooding, known as glacial lake outburst floods, acronym GLOF. These catastrophic flooding are occurring at an alarming increase, putting communities at risk, in great risk in India, Nepal, and China. And a very similar situation is happening or has been happening in Peru, in the Peruvian Andes. A GLOF is a glacial outburst flood, a glacial lake outburst flood, happened in Peru in 1941 and took 1,800 lives. Peru has since been actively addressing this issue. So I'm going to point now, these regions in the Tibetan Plateau, which is the high plateau there, have given rise to 4 major rivers. Where these rivers flow, they define civilization and nations. India, Pakistan, northern India, Pakistan, Tibet, and Nepal. Rivers emerging from the eastern Himalayas, I'm going to point now, this green river here, the Brahmaputra, is mostly fed by the summer monsoon. So the Brahmaputra River, the flow may well increase as a warming climate puts more moisture into the atmosphere. But I now call your attention to the Indus River on the eastern side, right there, drawn here in brown. Most of the water in the Indus comes from the proverbial water towers, which is the snow and glacier melts of the Himalaya. India is named after Indus, there's a connection there. When independence was declared in 1947 and the partition of the old British colony created India and Pakistan, each country got less of the Indus than it wanted. Some 270 million people in 4 countries, China, Tibet, India, and Pakistan, depend on the Indus River. This river, which was historically revered, is now viewed as a resource. India, Pakistan, and China have huge populations and abundant reasons to protect their resources. All 3 countries have nuclear weapons. And add to this dam building. And one can see dams built on the line of control between India and Pakistan. You can guess this doesn't go well. So China controls the headwaters of the Indus River, by the way. And in 2006, China constructed a dam without informing India and Pakistan, both countries which heavily depend on this river. But I'm going to put aside the volatile geopolitics of water and focus instead on the multitude of powerless who live in these Himalayan regions. Climate, glaciation, and now its effect on women. I'm just going to point it out because water is a woman's issue. Women are the major force in agricultural sector, both in Asia and Africa. They tend to the farms, raise the cattle, grow their food, take care of the children, feed the family. I mean, don't get me wrong, men are there also, but the burden on and the collateral damage of climate change is women. So when there's an abundance of water due to rain or flooding, there's no food for cattle. People leave to find work. Here you go, climate migration. And because of a lack of food, hunger leads to disease. Flooding happens in all these rivers of the Himalayas due to climate warming up. And then sometimes there's lack of water due to dams being built in strategic locations politically. When this affects India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, all of these regions, can you imagine the millions of people? Lack of access to glacial water due to dams upstream have tremendous negative impact on the lives of millions. It affects the fisheries in the Mekong Delta, the silt for agriculture, loss of land due to flooding, loss of home, for millions and millions and millions. Water runs through all of it. It is the politics of water. But for our final section, this is a section that is often left unspoken, and I feel it deserves to be told. Movement of spirit due to these high mountains and glaciers. Because it's a fact, historically, glaciers have melted, and yet life has continued. Chicago is living proof of it. We are the beneficiaries of Lake Michigan, which is a product of glacial melt. So regardless of what happens, life goes on. The Pico Humboldt Glacier in Venezuela will disappear if it hasn't disappeared already because of warming climate. And so what happens when glaciers disappear? The land is still there. Lichens and moss take over, and after many years, soil will be generated and a new ecosystem will form. Nature hates a vacuum. Even with glacier melt, though the human population will thin, we will not disappear. There will be mass migration, just as there was migration after the last ice age, when humanity walked across the globe. So it'll be a history repeating itself with somewhat dire consequence, because we do have weapons of mass destruction. But my interest is in the formless aspect, the spirit that moves. Because across the world, mountains, high places are the material window to the human spirit. Be it in the Andes in South America or the Himalayas in Asia, these mountains are linked to religious, spiritual beliefs. Glaciers are melting, reshaping centuries-old rituals. The Andes, which is the longest mountain range in the world, it spans 7 countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Peru. And the Snow Star Festival in Peru, traditionally in late May or early June, mixes Roman Catholic beliefs with indigenous beliefs. So they honor both Jesus Christ as well as the area's glaciers, which is considered sacred by the indigenous people. A central part of their pilgrimage is a sanctuary at the base of the mountain, Coglierici. Pilgrims say that when they used to walk up here years before all the retreating glaciers due to global warming, they didn't need to carry lanterns to find the way at night, that there was enough moonlight reflecting off the glacier, illuminating all. When they arrived at the sacred sites at night, their mother moon made the place into a heaven, into a dream. The Himalayas are integral to the mythology and creation of Hinduism. Pilgrims go to the mountains, but one doesn't need religion to realize the profound movement of spirit due to alpine glaciers. The enormity of them makes one realize the transcendental heart of creation. the unfathomable quiet, the muffle of snow, be it on the mountain or at sea level, the floating ice in Jökulsárlón in Iceland, the deafening silence of such places absolutely stills you. The atmosphere itself is a meditation, that one is at home in this world. There is no need to give it a name. Sheer reverence of that spirit, the realization strikes one dumb that this blue marvel is dancing through the heavens. Both our planet and our physical human body is 70% water. Neither will survive without it. We are stewards of magnificence. What can one do to protect this beautiful fragility from the catastrophes of global warming, fractious geopolitics, the news that surround us and divert us from silent, powerful truths? And for that, I turn to an Indian parable. It said that there was once a king who had stepped on a thorn and cut his foot. And in anger, to protect himself in the future, he ordered the entire land to be covered in leather. A wise minister suggested that perhaps he and everyone should instead just cover the bottom of their own feet. Footwear, imagine that. A much more ecological and holistic solution. Well, if you apply that, I take a very similar approach to protecting nature and protecting the waters. I cannot solve a global issue, but I do my part, my share, not to make it worse. Reusing water, conserving water, telling my children not to let the taps run, not waste water for an emerald green lawn, planting native species, using less energy, simple things like that, but things that take effort and are worth the effort. In the deep faith and belief that my individual contribution, though a drop in the bucket, when accumulated with other droplets, can form a rivulet, and in turn, they form a river, which eventually flows into something much larger than itself or ourselves. If oxygen is the breath that keeps life alive for everyone, water is alive for me. H2O. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us for this series. I hope you found it meaningful, because I'm very grateful to have had the time to share these stories with you and learn with you.